After more than a year of waging war in Ukraine, Russians are now experiencing some of the violence on their own soil. In Belgorod, just across the border from Ukraine, the region's governor says at least 4 people were injured after what they're describing as a massive strike. That follows a possible drone attack overnight on a Russian oil refinery. See the pictures there. Local officials say a fire put out quickly and there were no casualties. Still, the scope of these attacks, the frequency, drawing attention. CNN's Fred Pleitkin, he's in Kyiv. And Fred, we've seen a series of these attacks on both Russian-held territory in Ukraine, but also, crucially, the territory of Russia. What are Ukrainian officials saying about this, or are they keeping deliberately coy?
Well, first, I would say they're absolutely keeping deliberately coy, but they certainly are making suggestions that possibly they might have a certain role in all of this. It was quite interesting earlier today, Jim, that an advisor to Ukraine's presidency, he came out and he said, look, we're not going to say that we're behind all of this. However, one of the things that he did say is that attacks like these are going to increase, that the war is increasingly going to come to Russians and going to come especially to those border areas in Russia. You had, of course, that drone attack in Moscow, which the Ukrainians have said that they had no direct involvement in. Obviously, that a coy statement in itself. But if we look at that Belgorod region, the one that you were talking about, I think that's something that is really key when we look at that, because from there we've been hearing about cross-border attacks really for the past couple of weeks. Last week, you had that raid by those anti-Putin Russian fighters that went across the border there in Belgorod. Today, you have that shelling, which the governor there said he's extremely concerned about. And I was looking at the area where that is. It's in a village called Shebekino, which is right by the border. It's a small little village, but it is also very close to the actual town of Belgorod, which of course we know, Jim, is a major logistic hub, not just for the Russian military in itself, but also for their invasion of Ukraine. So certainly this is having an unnerving effect on the Russians, on the Russian military, and very much also on the people who live down there, Jim.
Listen, I remember you standing on that border, not far from Belgorod, at the very first stages of this war, watching those Russian tanks roll in. Fred Pleitkin in the capital, Kyiv. Thanks so much.
Kyiv is getting a break after days of incessant Russian strikes. However, we are seeing an uptick in action across the border. 5 people were wounded in attacks in Russia's Belgorod region, something the Kremlin calls alarming. And there may not be a let-up anytime soon. A group of dissident Russian fighters who claimed last week's incursion inside Belgorod is now recruiting drone pilots. This comes a day after a drone attack on Moscow. Russia's foreign ministry blames Ukraine and is vowing to retaliate. CNN's Sam Kiley has our report.
Same war, different capital. Moscow hit by a squadron of 8 drones.
There was a deafening bang, as if a huge bolt of lightning had struck somewhere near.
The attack was immediately blamed on Ukraine, which reels daily from Russian air assaults.
This morning, the Kiev regime carried out a terrorist attack on the Moscow region, and I will stress, aimed at civilian targets. In total, 8 airplane-type drones were used. All of them were brought down.
Kyiv was coy about its role in this drastic escalation.
Of course, we enjoy watching and predicting an increase in attacks, but of course, we have nothing to do directly with it. What is growing in Russia is the karmic payment that Russia will gradually pay more highly for everything it does in Ukraine.
Ukraine's threatening an offensive to drive Russian troops out. Part of its tactics have been increased efforts to destabilize Moscow's forces. A cross-border raid by anti-Putin Russian dissidents was backed by Ukraine last week. Frequent attacks on Russian-occupied logistic hubs like Mariupol and Berdyansk, and now there's a mysterious drone attack that Russia has blamed on Ukraine.
Though I'm more worried not by this, but by efforts to provoke a Russian response. That appears to be the aim. They are provoking us to do the same.
But this is the first drone attack by anyone on Moscow outside the Kremlin. Here, Kyiv attacked for the 17th time this month. Putin's generals now know that they face attacks on Ukraine's front lines and at home. Sam Kiley, CNN, Eastern Ukraine.
Well, CNN's Sam Kiley is with us right now. We've heard the messaging coming through from Russia saying they're ready to retaliate. Ukraine says they're not to blame for what we've seen in Belgorod. And Kyiv is quiet, which I think is very telling. The big concern here is that the war could be moving to Russia. What are you hearing, Sam?
Well, I'm not sure it's a concern at all, Leni. If you're a Ukrainian, you'd be absolutely delighted by that development. And there is indeed widespread irony and delight over the fact that now the Ukrainians are beginning to show the Russians what being at war really feels like. Now, the downside of that, obviously, is that inevitably the number of people being injured and killed are civilians. But the Ukrainians do appear to be trying at least to focus their attentions on strategic targets like the oil refinery down in Krasnodar, but local authorities much further north, just on the northern border between Ukraine and Russia in the Belgorod region, have said that 6 people there, all of them civilians, have been injured, that children are having to be evacuated from alongside other civilians from border villages as what is now becoming almost routine cross-border shelling by Ukraine into Russia. The other way round had become dangerously routine, and throughout this war on an almost daily basis, northern villages were getting shelled by Russia. So we're seeing this as part of, I think, the early stages, or perhaps even the main focus of Ukraine's counteroffensive. Advisor to President Zelensky has said on national TV that there's going to be an exponential increase in these sorts of attacks. The problem for the international community is that there are undertakings from the Ukrainians not to use the weapons donated by foreign powers for attacks inside Russia. But James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, given a bit of top cover or even a green light for the Ukrainians, saying that attacks against military infrastructure inside Russia was consistent with Ukraine's right to self-defense and were therefore legitimate targets. And as a consequence of that, he's been added, rather the Kremlin, via Medvedev, the former president and prime minister, now deputy head of the National Security Council in Russia, has tweeted out saying that members of the British government now considered legitimate military targets by Russia. That is part of the sort of public relations tit for tat. But the significance really is that James Cleverly has come out and said that as far as the United Kingdom is concerned, within certain parameters, they're fine with the idea that Russia gets attacked by Ukraine. Eleni.
Yeah, Sam Kiley, thank you so much.